See ya. Well, you know, the economy, though, all of that aside, it does seem that it might be heading toward an implosion right now. I want you to take a look at the latest foreclosure numbers. More than 327,000 properties in the third quarter. It's higher year over year now for the second consecutive month. 19 straight months it went down. 2 months in a row it's up. But even more alarming, repossessions up 66% from a year ago. Take a listen to some of these numbers. Nevada up 844%. New York 560%, New Jersey 400%, Georgia almost 200%, North Carolina also up almost 200%. So it's housing and all this other data pointing to an impending disaster. Niall Ferguson, I want to go to you. Liz Layman talked about Jack Lew talking, the debt ceiling being a self-inflicted wound. It feels like we've got a lot of wounds that are open right now.
Yes, Charles, it's one of those things that really is a bit of an absurdity, because if you want to stop worrying about the debt ceiling, get rid of the deficit. It's the deficit that makes the debt grow. That's clearly not going to happen, and in that sense, it's inevitable that the debt ceiling has to be raised periodically by Congress. It's a bit of a political absurdity if one thinks about it. The only thing that can be said is that at least the deficit has come down from the sky-high levels that we saw back in the wake of the financial crisis, and that should be pointed out. It should be pointed out it's partly a consequence of things like the sequester that did indeed tighten the fiscal belt across the U.S. government. You know,
Lou, the notion that it's technically impossible to make these kind of cuts because it's so complicated boggles the mind.
Well, it does. And the idea that the government doesn't have the ability to constrain itself in writing checks to vendors or to whomever is laughable. But more preposterous to me is that the Republicans would even advance the intimation that they would take this to some sort of precipice and start threatening again, having learned nothing from their history over the recent decade, as recently as a year ago. The political price they pay for just the nonsense. Leave it alone, authorize the debt ceiling and move on. There are far more important substantive issues than dealing with the debt ceiling when you control two parts of three-part government.
They did win a majority in Congress.
Oh, yeah, but
in the aftermath.
Who cares? Who cares? That had nothing to do with their majority. The reality is it's time for grown-up politics, and what is passing for Republican leadership in Washington better understand. Inevitably, they're the ones who are blamed irrespective of the broader context and the shared responsibility. The Republicans play the role of chumps every time they pursue this nonsense.
Niall, should we eliminate the debt ceiling? No other country has it. And if we do, at what point does it become a problem? I would think 18 trillion would be a frightening number.
Well, in truth, the number only is frightening if you ignore the gross domestic product, which it has to be compared with. Let's face it, the fiscal problems of the United States are far larger if you look away from these numbers and consider the large unfunded liabilities of the Medicare system and the Social Security system. And we're still a long way from having addressed the long-run imbalances in U.S. fiscal policy. Just because the deficit has come down in the last few years doesn't mean that we've solved those structural problems. And I think the public uneasily is aware that this is a problem that is simply being postponed. It's going to get worse as a result of changing demographics. And the problem is that the political class in Washington just can't seem to talk about this in an adult way. And so instead of a serious discussion of the kind of fiscal reforms that some of us have been arguing for what feels like 10 years, we have a silly game about a debt ceiling that is completely arbitrary. If Congress and the President cannot agree on a way to balance the budget, then obviously the debt is going to go up because there's going to be a deficit each year. If you look at the Congressional Budget Office numbers, they project deficits for the rest of time, deficits for the infinite future. So having an argument about a debt ceiling, right, if you have agreed in effect to borrow every year, is just Alice in Wonderland territory.
But it's not Alice in Wonderland, of course, Social Security, Medicare. Now, you talk about a lack of political will, Lou. what politician, I heard Chris Christie came out with something for Social Security early into the campaign. I think it was a disaster.
I'm laughing because none of these people right now are being serious about our fiscal policy, just as the professor points out. And Neil, if I may say hello and congratulations on your new book. Neil Ferguson is one of the best minds critically judging this society and putting it, our politics in important context, whether it be the broader economy, whether it be our history. The reality is that is not happening in Washington, D.C. And I would just like to say to the Republican leaders, for crying out loud, don't pull this nonsense anymore. I implore you. Because it is absolutely absurd to think that there is any benefit, that there is any advantage in it. Because right now, Congress is looked upon as something of a shambles by, what, 90% of the population. A lower rating than President Obama.
You're right. Might be,
I mean, why not focus, as Neil suggests?
Yeah.
The issue is, how are you going to run a government? And this is no way to run a government. This is no way to run a country right now. We've seen 7 years of absurdity. When he talks about debt, Neil, we're talking about being a debtor nation in perpetuity. We continue to persist between $400 billion and $500 billion in deficit every year. You don't find your way to the promised land that way. You find your way to devastation.
Well, I just want to echo what you said about Neil Ferguson and apply it to you as well. I was really lucky to have both of you guys on this morning. Two amazing minds, two amazing thought leaders, particularly when it comes to economy and leadership. Thanks a lot, Neil, and thanks a lot, Lou.
Good to see you, Charles.
You too.
Thank you.